Welcome everybody, welcome back to Using Semiotics in Marketing, and here's where we really get into actually doing some work together, which I'm so excited about because I want everybody to come away from this webinar series with new skills. That's what we're here for. So this time we're going to be talking about the contents of chapters 1 to 3 of Using Semiotics in Marketing, and there's quite a lot of exciting stuff going on there. Let's take a look at what's coming up. But first, let me talk about this week's business news. What I'll do each time I see you is I'll try and introduce a business story that's relevant for the week and that we can start to use as a fresh example for semiotics. So Animal Crossing, perhaps you've heard of it. It's a video game. It's a massively successful video game. It's a Japanese product made by Nintendo. And it was released in March 2020. Now, this is actually the latest iteration of a whole series of games called Animal Crossing that go back years and years. The one before this was called New Leaf, and it was back in 2012. And it was a successful product for Nintendo, and they sold 15 million copies of the game, right? And I think, you know, if you sell 15 million of anything, you're doing okay, right? And it was regarded as a successful product. Then Animal Crossing New Horizons was released 8 years later in March this year, just as the pandemic really kicked in and lockdown happened. And New Horizons sold 11 million copies in the first 6 weeks, which is tremendous. Nintendo are absolutely overjoyed. The hardware for playing this game is sold out. It is the game of the pandemic, okay? It may look like a children's game. It's mainly played by adults, actually. And children as well, and youths and people of all ages. And it is packed full of semiotic signs. So what you're looking at here is a screenshot from the game. This is the type of scenario that the player will see when they're inside the game in action, so to speak. So that little character in the middle might be your avatar, and she or he will run around this island that you see here and accomplish various tasks and build a little house and make friends with little animal neighbors and do various other things, right? So this project is a digital project. It's entirely packed full of semiotic signs, which we're going to talk about a lot today. And it is a game which is making Nintendo extremely wealthy and is satisfying the needs of 11 million consumers in the last 6 weeks alone. So it's interesting stuff, and I'll refer back to it from time to time as an example as we talk about this week's themes. Okay, so chapters 1 to 3. What's in this? With a bit of luck, you've read these chapters already in anticipation of this session. If not, don't worry too much. I'll try and get you up to speed. Okay. So chapter 1 is a few essential facts about semiotics, because we need some common language and stuff so that we can get started talking about it, right? So there's a few essential things that will help you to form a clear idea of how semiotics is different from other types of market research and what kinds of language and concepts people use when they're doing semiotics. Chapter 2 is entirely devoted to a case study, business case study, concerning the rebranding of the Charmin toilet paper brand, which is now Crucial in the UK and is the number 2 brand outside of retailer brands. And so this was a business study that I wrote back in 2011 with my clients at a time when they needed to do some rebranding. They knew that consumers didn't want this to happen, and they were expecting, you know, it just had to be done for various business reasons. They were expecting economic gloom. They used semiotics to help them manage the rebranding process, and much to their surprise, far from gloom, the brand became much more successful than it had been previously. There's loads of facts and figures in that case study, which I made a point of including in the chapter, and that's why it's become somewhat of a landmark case study, because of the amount of detail that the client generously provides about things like how much the brand was worth and how they made their business decisions. So that's chapter 2, and then chapter 3 is given over entirely to setting out a concise recipe for doing a project in semiotics, which you can adapt to pretty much any marketing problem. Now, there's a lot of detail in the later chapters of this book about things like how to do analysis, how to convert your amazing insights into business strategy, how to share your findings with other people. There's a lot of detail about that type of stuff coming up in later chapters, right? But when we've finished reading this book and you're ready to kind of embark on your or continue your career in semiotics, chapter 3 is the chapter that I would anticipate that you'll want to return to, because it contains this short, concise recipe or set of instructions for how to do a research project. So once we've absorbed everything else, this will be the chapter that you'll come back to in the future as a reference guide. So these are the 3 chapters that we're going to be discussing this time. And I'm going to attempt to say interesting things about them, and then we'll have a discussion with you. I know that Ray's got a few questions for me, and I hope that you will have some questions for me as well. Whether you have already done some of the activities in chapters 1 to 3, like drafting a brief and or drafting a proposal, I would love to hear your questions and comments on that, and I'm more than willing to offer as much guidance as I can. Or if you haven't started those activities yet, if you've been a bit delayed or whatever, you're still very welcome to ask questions and ask me just for extra advice on how do I go about this. Right, so chapter 1 has a lot of stuff in it which is kind of essential knowledge. And so you've heard me use words like signs and codes and things like that before, but we're just going to talk about those things briefly so that everybody's clear, and to save you from having to try and remember what I said last time. In market research, there are 2 major ways of looking at things, and by things I mean essentially consumers and the world that they live in, because that's who we're selling to most of the time, right? So the market research historically has been very close to psychology, and it has borrowed a lot of theory and research techniques from psychology and imported them into a business situation. So what I mean by that is that for the longest time, market research was dominated by things like attitude surveys, and also by forms of qualitative research like focus groups and depth interviews, where consumers would be questioned individually about psychological matters, about things which exist inside their heads, such as attitudes to brands, beliefs about brands and categories, perceptions, and also motivations and emotions and all of this stuff, right? All of this language is the bread and butter of the market research industry, isn't it? And all of it is imported from psychology. And what we do with these market research methods is use psychological research tools. We use instruments like maybe interesting projective techniques and sorting exercises. And we use carefully crafted survey questionnaires and thoughtful and sensitive discussion guides. All of those are psychological tools, and they exist to get psychological stuff out of people's heads. Now, because there's this emphasis on trying to dig out secret stuff, excavating it and digging it out of people's heads and making it visible, this became known as the inside-out approach to research. Now, more recently, and by recently I mean over the last, altogether about 20 years in market research, but in academia actually about a century, there's a different paradigm, a different approach to research, which has caught on in market research in a noticeable way in the last couple of decades, and especially in the last few years. And this is called the outside-in approach to research, where instead of trying to get all this psychological stuff out of people's heads, we're instead asking, how did it get in there in the first place? Where did all these attitudes and beliefs and perceptions and motivations come from? And the answer is taken to be usually that they come from the surrounding culture in which each consumer has no choice but to be a part, okay? We're all paid up members of one or another culture, and we're all exposed to cultural influences and cultural messages and bits of ideology every single day just by being alive in the world, right? So this new family of culture methods arose to interrogate that stuff And this has become known as the outside-in approach to research, because we're investigating all of these things which exist at the level of society and culture and the history of ideas, which cause people to hold attitudes and beliefs and perceptions. Now, these culture methods notably include ethnography, which is actually an underrated method and one that I'll probably have some things to say about another time. There's semiotics, which is a big method, as you know, but I guess its hallmark is this ability to decode visual signs and symbols. That's what people tend to know it for. And then also, as part of this family, there's discourse analysis, which has a very precise focus on language and specifically the kind of mechanics of everyday conversation. So inside out, outside in, this is the big paradigm shift that we make when we move from traditional market research to something like semiotics. Let's see if we can take you to the next page. When we put this hat on, where we are thinking from an outside-in perspective, we're thinking about culture and cultural influences on consumers, it will give you a fresh point of view on all these types of everyday marketing problems which you see here, which I gathered together in the book under this heading, The Marketing Challenge Hot List, to give you a starting place. This is like a menu of problems that you can solve using semiotics. Now, if you think about it with a kind of outside-in perspective, or with your culture hat on, we can see that all of the items on this list can be understood at the level of culture and cultural influence. So, for example, if we take just this one in the middle, this red one in the middle, about making things seem more premium. Premiumness is not a particularly individual matter. What looks premium and what doesn't? In other words, what are the semiotic signs for premium? What kinds of things can you include in your project design and in your packaging that make something look premium to consumers? That is something which is what premium looks like, is something which is agreed at a cultural level. It's agreed at the level of the group. It's not really a matter for individual, just not much individual variation, right? So this is a great question for semiotics, and one that commercial semiologists will get handed all the time. Is we've got this brand and we want to make it seem like it's worth paying a bit more for. How can we do that? So we're asking cultural questions about where consumers get this idea. But then there are also more subtle ones, like if you go right down to the bottom, look at this blue square at the bottom, identifying convincing and relevant brand stories. Stories also exist at the level of culture, don't they? We have fairy tales, we have myths, we have fables, we have like modern day morality tales, often focused on public figures, like the kind of the rise and fall of celebrities, rags to riches to rags type of stories. All of these stories, almost by definition, exist at the level of culture. They don't exist at the level of the individual. And so what we're observing here is that all of these types of problems which marketers will regularly encounter, and where market research will try to step in, can be understood from the perspective of culture rather than the internal psychology of the individual. And that's very exciting because it opens up work for us as researchers and gives us opportunities to say something new, which is what we need to stay afloat in challenging times. Right then, let me come back to a few of the basic building blocks for semiotics. So by now, especially if you tuned in last time, you've heard me use the word sign quite a lot, semiotic sign. So let's just quickly clarify what's meant by that. One of the things that I do in the book is ask the reader to think of an apple. And then I ask some questions about, actually I ask them to think of a fruit, and then my question is the fruit an apple, and what colour is it? Is it red? And I then use this example to go on and talk about how, if you look at the way that people use language and visual representation, apples are the go-to fruit for visually depicting all fruit. And when apples appear in, as they frequently do, in things like clip art and children's books and things like that, they're always red, even though apples in real life are quite a variety of colours. They're green, yellow, some of them are brown. Most apples have got actually more than one colour going on. But in the world of our cultural imagination, our collective imagination, apples are red. And apples signify not just apples, but fruit in general. And this is why, so for example, for people who've got kids, you know, when you start showing your child books of colours and things like that, or letters of the alphabet and things like that, the very first page of those children's books is always A is for apple. So what we're observing here then in our still from Animal Crossing is a large collection of semiotic signs. So, and here are some red apples over here, which are a semiotic sign indicating that there's probably actually quite a variety of fruit growing on this island. Also, they look tempting, don't they? They look juicy and shiny and rather luscious. And we might notice that coconut tree in the background as well there. What this is clearly communicating very efficiently is that on this island, which you may have yet to visit, you're going to be able to find tropical climate and a more kind of pastoral climate. So there's quite a lot going on there. And every single item that you're looking at on this screen is a semiotic sign, just like the red apple, okay? So the palm tree in the background there, the beach towel, the transistor radio. Isn't that quaint, by the way? Notice how our character is not using her iPhone, for example, to listen to music. You know, she's got this old-fashioned transistor radio. We've got this, what looks like it could be a cocktail in that coconut shell. We've got this large dragonfly. All of these, there's of course this careful treatment of the sky and the sand and things like that, and this bluish green of the sea. All of these things are semiotic signs, just like you would find in advertising, just like you would find in packaging, which your consumer, as a result of their previous cultural experiences, has learned how to interpret, right? So what we can understand is that this is a scene of relaxation. If you play this game, it's promising that you will have a relaxing, escapist experience. You can get away from all your troubles. It's going to be almost as good as being on holiday. No wonder it's popular as soon as lockdown happened. So a semiotic sign then is a small unit of communication which has been invested with meaning, not by the individual, but at the level of culture. The semiotic sign is the smallest unit of analysis in semiotics. And the other word that you'll come into contact with a lot when you're doing this type of thing is code, okay? I'll try and explain this in really simple, practical language. A code is a number of semiotic signs which are regularly found in the same place at the same time. That's the hallmark of the code. So I picked what we've got here. Actually, we've almost got two separate codes going on in this image. The main one perhaps is something like beach holiday. So we've got here the transistor radio, the towel, the cocktail, the shoes left on the beach and not being worn on the feet, the campfire, the shells, the coastline, the coconut, the palm tree, maybe the dragonfly. All of those things are working together to produce a certain type of meaning, which is something like being on a relaxing or luxurious beach holiday. And then over here on the left, we've got a hint of a alternative code, which is something more like a rural or pastoral idyll. So over here, we've got the fruit trees, we've got deciduous trees, we've got some wildflowers and maybe even some weeds growing on the grass there. It's not too heavily curated. So we've got a competing code over there, and a hint of a competing code, which has to do with something like country gardens. So a code is a collection of semiotic signs which are frequently found together in the same place at the same time. They add up to some larger meaning, so that the towel, the radio, the shell, the coconuts all add up to a bigger meaning, which is this total experience of something like being on a beach holiday, which most consumers will have had some experience of. And codes contain sets of instructions for consumers about how to understand the world and how to behave. So what this particular, if we concentrate on this beach holiday code that we see going on here, there's a built-in set of instructions there that describe reality. Okay, so in this case, what they're telling you is this video game is not about fighting. It's not about a zombie apocalypse. There's not going to be any World War I tanks. It's going to be a game about exploring and probably farming and maybe a bit of social interaction. So the code describes reality, and it also contains a set of instructions for the consumer about how to appreciate the game, right? So before you've even purchased the game or booted it up, you've received a set of instructions about how to tackle it. It doesn't look competitive. I don't see any ranking systems here. She's not wearing armor or carrying a big sword. You can see from the beginning what's going to be involved here. There's going to be a lot of wandering around and collecting items and behaving in a fairly non-aggressive way. So sign, small unit of communication, code, collection of semiotic signs that upholds a certain version of reality and tells people how to behave. And this is the essence of bottom-up analysis, which you can deploy when you're looking at advertising, packaging, branded web copy, and all of that type of communication that brands like to put out about themselves. Let's go to the next page. There you go. So when we've got two kinds of analysis then in semiotics, bottom up and top down. In reality, although I've talked about this stuff as though it's two separate stages of a project for the sake of being clear in this book, as you become experienced with semiotics, you'll find that you're doing bottom-up and top-down analysis at the same time, and that your work and that your brand actually is going to sit in the middle, because the meaning of any brand is influenced from both directions. So what do I mean by that? The bottom-up stuff is all the stuff I've been talking about, right? In Animal Crossing, for example, there's a lot of fruit. Can you see how the apple has been chosen by some designers to be the first item on this list here? That's not a mistake. So here we've got these fruit items. They're very simplistically but quite attractively rendered, and they're loaded with meaning. And identifying semiotic signs and figuring out what they mean and what kind of experience they're promising the consumer, what they're saying about the product, that's bottom-up analysis, okay? It's great for kind of decoding and rejigging brand communications. At the same time, there's a second half to semiotic analysis, which is called top-down analysis, and I dedicate an entire chapter to this, which we'll talk about next time, which is about, rather than decoding individual semiotic signs, we're using some of the principles of semiotics to decode society, to decode the big movements in society, in the world, which could be at the level of the environment, at the level of an epidemic disease, at the level of the economy, at the level of like political change and upheaval. There's stuff going on in the world that helps to stimulate consumer needs of different kinds and provides the context in which your client's brand will sit, okay? So Animal Crossing is not just successful because it's adorable and cute and incredibly safe and promises a relaxing experience. It's also successful because it is doing those things in a context of fear, anxiety about our own mortality, extreme anxiety about economic uncertainty, and so forth, right? So key terms then: bottom up, start with the small semiotic signs and figure out what they mean. Top down, start with big questions about society and about the big ideas and big cultural influences that are forming a context for your brand and having an effect on consumer behavior. So that's all the terminology you need, really, okay? So we've got inside out versus outside in, we've got signs versus codes, and we've got bottom up versus top down. If you've got those terms reasonably clear in your head, you've got what you need to do the work. That's not to say there isn't more, there's always more, but those are the essentials. When you then look at the sort of marketing questions that clients will bring to you, like the problems that you see on that marketing challenge hot list, you should be able to identify fairly easily that some of them translate readily into bottom-up questions, right? So, for example, we can see that there's a problem with our brand communications. Like, I don't know, we want to appear friendly, but consumers telling us we'd come off as remote and distant, so we need to change our communications. Or it could be something like, in our category, our competitors are doing a better job than we are of talking about, I don't know, innovation, and we want to be able to handle our own brand a bit better. These are bottom-up questions where you can start by looking at brand communications, identify the semiotic signs and the codes, and start picking things apart and saying what they mean. Other common marketing questions, more naturally framed as top-down questions. And this is where you will hear clients say things like, it's a very common one, that our brand is well established, but our customers are getting older, and we need to find a way of engaging younger consumers. That's a very common problem, and you can see it's not really about the details of brand communications, it's about the needs of entire generations or demographics, right? Or it could be a regional thing, you know. It could be like, we've got a successful brand, exists in these countries, we want to move into some new territories that have distinctive cultural issues. How can we get it? How can we position it in the right way? Those are top-down questions. And so when you write your proposal, you're the designer of this project. It's entirely up to you to decide how much bottom-up stuff do you want, how much top-down stuff do you want to include. It's going to depend on what the client needs to achieve and your own decision about how you want to do the work and what's going to be the most useful for you. Let's see what else we've got for you. So I'm wondering at this point, if you're following along with this webinar series and doing all the exercises and stuff, by now you will have chosen a project to work on, because this is my ambition for this webinar series, is that you should actually do some semiotics while we've got this time together. If you haven't chosen a project yet, it's not too late. Between now and the next time I see you, go to the Marketing Challenge hot list, pick something that resonates with your own experience of marketing or market research, and just take it from there. Now, for those of you who have picked one or who are about to pick one, what follows then in chapter 3 of this book is a dead simple, concise recipe for doing research, and you can use this to structure your proposal. So let's just talk about what's in here. Again, there's more detail on every aspect of this throughout the book, but sometimes you just need everything on one page. So in the future, when you're writing, you need to write a proposal, research proposal that uses semiotics, use this recipe. Here it is, all in one page. Number one thing you're going to do is try and clarify your client's marketing problem, and form an opinion at an early stage about, does it sound more bottom up? Does it sound top down? Is it a mix of the two? And try and be as clear as possible about what your client actually wants to achieve, because sometimes clients are just people like everybody else. Sometimes they're not 100% sure what they're trying to achieve. And sometimes that will be obscured by use of kind of marketing jargon. So it's really, the best thing you can do for everybody is to make it really clear for both you and them up front what outcome we're trying to achieve business-wise. When you've nailed that, you can then start to think about that client's question from a bottom-up point of view and from a top-down point of view. So bottom-up, what are the key signs and symbols in circulation in this category or in this aspect of consumer life? Figure out what they mean. And also, what are the big social forces? What's happening right now in these people's lives that's making a difference? Is there a pandemic? Is everybody on lockdown? Is the economy crashing? Or conversely, are people feeling optimistic as they're being sort of, you know, is there good news that's affecting a whole nation? That type of thing. Generate as many research questions as you can. Try, just for the exercise, try and make a point of asking both top-down and bottom-up questions about your client's problem, and then you can just kind of sift out the ones that that you feel are going to be most successful in getting you to some answers. Have a quick brainstorming session with your client or colleague at an early stage in the project, so that it's important for clients to feel that they're being heard, And they know that they've got valuable information about consumer behaviour and about the category and the brand's business performance that they would like to share with you, probably, if you give them a chance. So make a point of being interested and let them educate you about what they know and how they understand the world. The next step you're going to do is to go on to choose and sample data, and I talk quite extensively in the book about a number of different kinds of data that you can use. The one that people will default to is they'll wait for their client to hand them some advertising and packaging, but you've got many, many other options. You might choose to do some library research. You might choose to expose yourself to some online communities of consumers. You might want to go out and do some product shopping or some observational field trips. Essentially, our data set in semiotics is any form of communication that humans have produced, right? Which could be like pop music, graffiti, architecture, people's decorations inside their homes, meals that they've made and photographed and put on Instagram and all of that type of stuff, right? So the world is your oyster, really, when it comes to sampling data. There's so much of it out there, you'll never be short of data. It's up to you then to decide what kind you want to include. When you've got a data set, look for some semiotic signs, look for those red apples, figure out what they mean, list all your semiotic signs. Once you've listed them all, you should be able to observe that at least some of them are clustering into codes, like that relaxing beach holiday code that we were just looking at with Animal Crossing. Then ask some questions about what's going on in society. And when I say this, I don't just mean like current affairs, like, oh, there's a pandemic, everybody's stuck at home. Ask some penetrating questions about who's affected by this. Is anybody benefiting from this situation? Are some people suffering more than others? So some people who are kind of commentators on contemporary culture are observing that this virus is disproportionately, like in the UK, for example, it's disproportionately affecting poor people. Lockdown is also especially hard on poor people. And it's also, there may be elements of institutional racism built in here as well. I spoke to a doctor quite recently. She's a recently retired GP, and she's quite hot on social justice issues. And she said to me, have you noticed how amongst the people who are dying, there's like quite high rates of Afro-Caribbean bus drivers and Indian doctors, you know. So where professions have gender or ethnic bias, I suppose you want to say, or overrepresentation, that's going to become visible when there's a crisis like a pandemic, for example, and people start dying in large numbers, but some people die more than others. That's what I mean about detecting social structures. I mean thinking about things like gender, social class, ethnicity, and how that filters people's experience of national and international events. That's all your analysis completed at that point. And what you want to do then is return to your client's business problem, make some connections between the insights that you've developed and their business needs, which is you'll find easier if you've done all the preparatory stuff at the top, especially that brainstorming session. Then you're going to write up your recommendations as straightforwardly as possible, use some evidence that people can see with their eyes, use simple language, and finally share the results with your client. And don't forget to talk about how to communicate with their stakeholders as well. That's essentially it. Next time, just to give you a reminder of what's coming up next time we're going to get deep into the details of how to do analysis, and I'll share some semiotic tools for being creative and innovating. And in the session after that, I'll talk about observational field trips, using semiotics with other methods, and how to turn insight into strategy. And then finally, in the final chunk of this series, we'll talk about what's the best way to write up and present your findings so that they're convincing for people. And we'll talk about some stuff about the future of semiotics and the future of your career as well. But that's for next time. Let's now turn to Ray. Thank you very much, everybody, for listening to me talk. And let's talk then about this week's topic, which is chapters 1 to 3 and those activities of writing a brief and a proposal.